And yeah, so the text that we're sort of looking at today, which is what Michelle has referring to, is Matthew chapter 11, verses 28, 29, and 30. So yeah, so let's have a look at that and just talk a little bit around that. But I guess she's done the application, so I'll just kind of do the Bible stuff, and we'll do the talk backwards today. So Jesus speaking here, he says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I'll give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I'm gentle and humble in heart, and you'll find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." And that's a good reminder for us today. It's a good reminder for us today, for every day, that Jesus invites us to come to him, and that in doing so, we experience rest. Because I often we can be pulled in probably two extremes, and I often kind of sit maybe on the other extreme of hearing the kind of ethical demands that Jesus invites us into, or maybe summons us to follow. Think of the Sermon on the Mount and various other things like that. Like if we literally just on my Bible, if you turn back one page to Matthew 10, 37, 38, 39, Jesus says this: anyone who loves their father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. Anyone who loves their son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. Whoever does not take up their cross and follow me is not worthy of me. Whoever finds their life will lose it, and whoever loses their life for my sake will find it. So on the one hand, Jesus is saying to follow me, you have to give up your entire life. You have to give up everything to follow me. That's essentially the message. And elsewhere Jesus says the same thing, like in Luke. Jesus says, "Yeah, anyone who wants to follow me must take up their cross daily and follow me." So it's the classic message of Jesus. And then we have this passage, which seems to be at the other end of the extreme, where Jesus says, "Just come to me; it's going to be okay. It's my burden is easy, my yoke is light." We've talked about this lots of times before, but maybe there's some kids that hear the word yoke and they're like, "What the heck is Jesus talking about?" Maybe picturing a egg yolk on their head or something ridiculous like that. And that's not that word yoke that we're talking about, where this is Y-O-K-E, yoke. It's a farming metaphor. So you might have seen pictures back in the day, or even in the developing world, where we tend to use tractors, but other parts of the world will use animals to pull a plow. And so the yoke is the sort of bit that goes onto the animal, and then back from that is the plow that the animal pulls. So that's a yoke, right? And for subsistence farmers that can't afford an animal to pull the plow, they put the yoke on themselves, right? And they just plow the field themselves with the yoke. And so Jesus is sort of using this really humiliating kind of metaphor. Jesus is saying, "I've got a yoke that I'm carrying around, and take on the same yoke that I'm carrying around." And there's this contrast between Jesus is arguing with the Pharisees here in this text. And so there's all this stuff about the Sabbath, and the Pharisees got all these sort of intricate rules about the Sabbath and lots of other things, purity laws, etc. And there seems to be a real legalism, like you got to follow these rules. And if we follow, it's not about if you got to follow those rules to get into heaven. That's a misreading and misunderstanding of first century Judaism. But there's this idea of, if we follow all these rules, this was a common sort of belief in the first century. If all of Israel can just follow these rules even for a day, then God will come back, and God will usher in the new age. So the Messiah is related to all that and everything, right? So ironically here, Jesus is God who has come, and he is saying, take on my yoke, take on my burden, because the yoke became a metaphor for the law. So in the first century, Jews would talk about taking upon the yoke of the Torah or the yoke of the law, and so that understand that the law has a set of instructions to follow. It's a way of being human in the world, and that they were to do that, and they were to sort of the law is all about a covenant, right, between Israel and between God. So by following the laws, they were showing that they loved the covenant and they wanted to express their side of the covenant in the same way that we have like vows in a marriage relationship, right? When you in your daily life fulfill your vows, you give the vows at your wedding day, but then you do the vows for the rest of your life. That's the idea. Now you don't do the vows to sort of earn whatever. You do the vows to express your love and commitment to that particular relationship, right? So that's how the law worked in the first century. And so Jesus, when he's talking about his yoke, he's inviting his first century hearers into this new way of thinking about. It's not this heavy burden. It's not this impossible thing that if you do it, God will return. God has already returned. He is here, and Jesus is now inviting them into this new way of being human. Jesus is the fully human one that we're all to follow, right? So, yeah, this is just a beautiful passage that reminds us that following Jesus, in some ways, is not meant to be hard. In some ways, it's easy. My yoke is easy, and my burden is light. So there's a reminder for us this morning to return to Jesus. Maybe we've often putting stuff in our backpack, the weighing down thing often happens when we try and do stuff our own way. God's got the best way for you to live, the best way for you to be human, and Jesus invites us to follow him and to experience that way of life, the way of Jesus, the way of following Jesus. And it's often when we turn off that path to try and do stuff our own way, whether it's we all want intimacy, right? And there's certain ways to find intimacy in the way of Jesus, and then there's other ways outside of that to follow after intimacy, right? And so if we follow the non-Jesus ways, the backpack, we think it's all about feeling awesome, but ultimately it's not. It ultimately brings destruction. And so Jesus invites us to this wonderful way of being human. I guess so my encouragement to us today really then is just a reminder of this, and to ask the sort of pastoral question, what are the ways that you maybe turned off the path, that Jesus is calling you to a particular way of life, and you've turned away, you've turned aside to that to kind of try and do stuff in your own way, your own strength. Jesus is calling you and me and us this morning to return to his way of living life, and it's in the midst of that we'll find and what Jesus says here is rest, this Sabbath rest, and this is all these pictures of peace and joy, all the things that we really want, we will find when we find ourselves in relationship and following Jesus. So that's our reminder for today. There's lots of other passages like in Jeremiah and various other places we go to, but